Welcome to the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion orientation for you all, the board. My name is Mary Pat Ost, and I am the EDI lead for AACN. This is the first of 4 orientation modules. We're going to focus today on common language. All of us have a position in healthcare, and we have learned over time that we all care about similar things and that we share the same understanding of it. We have a common language. If we don't take the time to create a common language at the beginning of a collaborative effort, we can often find out way down the road that team members have had different operational understandings, and it can derail our work. With this in mind, we want to define core terms that we'll be using throughout your experience on the board. Everyone comes to this type of training on equity, diversity, and inclusion with different understandings of the material and the content. And that's normal. We all get here through different paths, even if we work in the same field and the same organization. So it really becomes essential to unpack the words we're using and create shared meaning so that we can really begin to fully explore these important concepts. As we designed these modules, but in particular this one, there were 2 objectives in mind. First was to create that foundational language that would allow us to make sure that we are using the terms and content in a similar way. And secondly, to understand why AACN chooses to use the term EDI as opposed to DEI, which many people are familiar with. So let's get started with common language. The first term we're going to talk about is perspective transformation. And this is a process of becoming critically aware of how and why our assumptions have come to constrain the way we perceive, understand, and feel about our world. Changing these structures of habitual expectation to make possible a more inclusive and integrative perspective. And finally, making choices or otherwise acting upon these new understandings. In essence, it means seeing something in a new light. You see and understand differently, so you do act and behave differently. Perspective transformation requires us to use both our head and our heart. And for many of us, it's really easy to jump right into the head space. It can sometimes be more difficult to jump into that heart work because that heart work occurs when we begin exploring our personal understanding of concepts of fairness and justice and create shared meaning with our collaborators. When we talk about the head work, that happens when we use logic and reason, maps and data, planning and metrics, technical detail and definitions. What we know is that when we move forward with the head work without investing any of the heart work, people get stuck. Equity isn't a word on a page, and when it comes down to interpreting shades of gray in our everyday decision-making, we need to have foundational discussions about what equity looks like in practice. At the same time, some people prefer to do the heart work without the head work. They want to appeal to the moral imperative to do the right thing. And that doesn't get them very far either because they need plans, strategies, and know-how. They know how they will have to measure success. In our equity equity work, we need to engage both our heads and our hearts in order to make progress, especially in a collaborative effort. In fact, one of the most critical steps in collaboration that involves both the head and the heart is doing just this, establishing and using a common language. So let's move on to diversity. Excuse me. And diversity is the visible and invisible mixture of differences and similarities between people that frames how we see the world and how we interact with others. It's not just about race or sex or gender. It's about many different things, including how we interact with the world, and in turn, how we see things, understand problems, connect with solutions, and work with others both internally and externally. Inclusion is the active, intentional, and ongoing engagement with diversity, including intentional policies and practices, promoting the full participation and the sense of belonging among all members of a group or an organization. Inclusion is the muscle of diversity. It's how we create an environment where everyone feels valued and able to show up to their jobs as their full selves. We usually think of it in this way. We need to have a diverse workforce, but we also need to have an inclusive workplace. Now we're going to talk about equity and explore the concept of equity. But before we do that, we need to explore what the differences are between equity and equality. In the US, we very frequently talk about them as if they're the same thing, and they're very different in reality. Equality, excuse me, is about treating everybody the same. No exceptions, everybody gets treated the same. Equity is different. Equity is providing all people with fair opportunities to achieve their full potential. So I'm going to give you an example of what equality looks like. So many of us know and love Oprah. And when she had the Oprah Winfrey Show, she used to have her My Favorite Things episodes. And for those of you that don't know, she did an annual segment where she gave away all of her favorite things to members of her audience. This could be fancy skin creams or cashmere blankets. One time she gave away a car. So today's your lucky day. You're at My Favorite Things show. You are all going to get, yep, every single one of you, a brand new pair of designer shoes. Aren't they lovely? These are a beautiful pair of Louboutin 4-inch stiletto heels, all in a women's size 7 medium. Don't you love them? Won't they look awesome? Well, what's wrong with that? These are expensive shoes. Everybody got the same thing. Well, this is equality. Everyone got the exact same thing, but not everyone's going to have a pair of shoes that they can wear. If each person got the type and size that they needed, then that would be equity. So the equity lens is something that you will hear us talk about a lot of times throughout the board meetings. You'll see it in reports, et cetera. Your equity lens is the lens through which you view conditions and circumstances to understand who experiences the benefits and burdens of a given program, policy, or practice. So let's talk about this a little more. If you take a look at this graphic, whoa. Here we go. Take a look at this graphic, which is another helpful one to understand the difference between equity and equality. And we like to use it to explain the equity lens. You might have seen this image or a version of it before. In the first box on the left, all of the kids are peeping over the fence at a cool, something cool. This looks like a baseball game. And they all have a box to stand on. You'll notice the first two kids have no trouble seeing over the fence. But the shortest kid has to peek through a crack in the fence. His box doesn't boost him high enough for an unobstructed view. But when we apply our equity lens, it's about understanding who's experiencing benefits and burdens and seeing if we can maximize the good experiences or mitigate the bad ones. The tall kid doesn't really need a box to see. And if the short kid has two boxes, then he's tall enough to peep over the fence and participate. This is a very simplified way of thinking about how an equity lens can help you create a better outcome for more people. We're going to take this one step further. When we add on the concept of liberation or justice, we have to ask the question, why is there a fence at all? Removing the systemic barriers that led to the inequities is justice. But then there's even one more question for us to consider. Why don't these kids have seats in the stands? So let's move on to part 2, which is pretty short. I'm going to talk about why AACN chooses to speak about EDI versus DEI. So one thing that you need to know is that DEI was sort of born out of a necessity. So many organizations early on in this work talked about diversity and inclusion, D&I, D&I, D&I. Well, then the concept of equity was introduced. And so rather than come up with diversity, inclusion, and an equity, which would be DIE, they stuck the E in the middle. So it came up with diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we're going to talk first about diversity. So diversity is the mixture of differences and similarities that includes individual and organization characteristics, values, beliefs, experiences, backgrounds, behaviors. It encompasses our personal and professional histories that frame how we see the world, collaborate with colleagues and stakeholders, and how we serve communities. It can be defined in terms of both observable and non-observable characteristics. And diversity is the primary outcome, and this is something that we can measure. Inclusion is the active and intentional and ongoing engagement with diversity, including policies, practices that promote the full participation of and sense of belonging of every individual. This includes the extent to which individuals can access information and resources and are involved in work groups or can influence decision-making. Inclusion is the way that we can achieve diversity. It's a mechanism. Equity is about providing all people with fair opportunities to attain their full potential to the highest extent possible. Not all individuals start from the same place. Some have a head start and more influence than others. Equity is knowing that every individual has the same intrinsic value as another. It's an intentional design of an environment engaged in challenging intentional and unintentional forms of bias and discriminating while promoting fair alternatives. Equity speeds up that process. It's a catalyst, an accelerator. So let's think about this a different way. Can you have an organization that's diverse but not inclusive? Yes, you can. So think about, has any of you watched The Good Fight on Paramount streaming service? In a recent episode, the partners were seeking to fill a partner vacancy in their law firm. There were several Black partners who were in favor of transitioning the firm to an all-Black firm. The white female partner had an equal voice, but was left out of all discussions about recruiting for a new partner. In fact, this organization, this law firm, could be perceived as diverse, but not inclusive. At the same time, can you be inclusive without being diverse? To be sure. Now let's think about the good fight scenario in a slightly different way. Let's say all the firm partners were involved in all organizational decisions. Well, that's true. And that's inclusive, definitely. But what if that all the firm's partners are Black? Are they diverse? No. So you can be diverse without being inclusive. You can be inclusive without being diverse. The question comes, can you be equitable without being diverse and inclusive? If equity is about providing an environment where individuals can show up as their authentic selves and contribute in a meaningful way, you must have both diversity and inclusion. Because if you don't have a multitude of perspectives and you don't include those perspectives in decision-making processes or in strategic planning or thoughtful discussions, then you really aren't going to have an equitable organization where you're really looking out and asking the questions about who benefits from and who is burdened by a particular decision that is made. So the reality is that diversity plus inclusion equals equity. So we do start with equity because that is a result of diversity and inclusion. And that's why we call it EDI. So thank you for taking the time to listen to this presentation today. Next module is going to be more definitions and concepts to explore on privilege, oppression, isms, bias, implicit bias, and intersectionality. Thanks again, and have a good day.